Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into something that history books tend to sanitize, something Hollywood glamorizes, and something most people never truly understand: the medieval battlefield. Not the shining armor and noble quests you see in movies, but the real thing. The blood-soaked mud, the screams that lasted for hours, and the smell that could knock you unconscious from a mile away. Before we get started, take a moment to like this video if you're ready for some brutal honesty about medieval warfare, and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world for these deep dives into history's darkest corners. Now, settle in. Maybe grab something to drink, because what we're about to explore isn't pretty, but it's real, and understanding the true horror of medieval battlefields helps us grasp just how brutal life really was 600 years ago. Picture this. You're a 20-year-old farmer's son, conscripted into your lord's army. You've never held a sword in your life, never seen a man die violently, never imagined the sounds a human throat makes when it's been sliced open. But here you are, standing in a muddy field at dawn, surrounded by thousands of other terrified souls, waiting for the horn that will send you charging toward your death. The reality of medieval warfare was nothing like the romanticized versions we see today. There were no clean sword fights, no honorable duels, no gentle deaths. Instead, there was chaos, terror, and a level of brutality that would make even hardened soldiers today question their sanity. Let's start with what you'd actually see, hear, and smell on a medieval battlefield. First, the ground beneath your feet. After just a few minutes of combat, the earth would be churned into a thick, reddish-brown soup of mud, blood, and human waste. Men would lose control of their bowels from fear or injury, and the metallic stench of blood would mix with the overwhelming smell of death, sweat, and excrement. The sounds were equally horrifying. Imagine the clash of metal on metal, but amplified by thousands of weapons striking simultaneously. Add to that the screams of wounded horses, the wet thudding of axes biting into flesh, and the desperate cries for help from men whose limbs had been severed. Some witnesses described it as a symphony from hell itself, but the visual horror was perhaps the worst part. Within minutes of combat beginning, the battlefield would be littered with body parts. Arms severed at the shoulder, legs chopped off at the knee, heads split cleanly in two by powerful axe blows. Medieval weapons weren't designed for clean kills. They were designed to maim, to terrorize, and to create wounds so horrific that they would break the morale of enemy forces. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Battle of Visby in 1361 gives us chilling insights into what actually happened to human bodies during medieval combat. Researchers examining the remains found at Visby discovered wounds that defy imagination. One soldier had the entire front of his skull cleaved in two, with the blade penetrating deep into his brain tissue. The same man had his left arm completely severed at the elbow and sustained multiple blade wounds to his face that divided his jaw in two and sliced away part of his upper jaw. But here's the truly horrifying part. This soldier also had 3 separate arrow wounds in his neck. Any one of these injuries would have been fatal, yet he sustained all of them in what was likely just a few minutes of combat. This wasn't unusual. The archaeological evidence shows that medieval warriors often suffered multiple severe injuries before finally succumbing to death. The weapons themselves were engineered for maximum damage. Take the English longbow, perhaps the most feared weapon of the medieval period. These weren't the lightweight bows you might see in movies. A proper English longbow stood over 6 feet tall and required between 150 and 180 pounds of force just to draw. The arrows they fired could penetrate armor at distances up to 1,000 feet. When a longbow arrow struck a human body, the results were catastrophic. Archaeological analysis has revealed arrow wounds that created entry and exit holes comparable to modern gunshot wounds. In one gruesome example from the Visby site, researchers found evidence of an arrow that entered through a warrior's right eye and exited through the back of his skull, leaving devastating wounds on both sides of his head. The power of these weapons meant that battlefield injuries were unlike anything we see today, even in modern warfare. A crossbow bolt could punch through chainmail and embed itself so deeply in bone that medieval surgeons often couldn't extract it. Sword blows could slice clean through limbs with a single strike. Warhammers could crush skulls like eggshells, leaving brains exposed to the elements. And then there were the specialized weapons designed purely for terror. The Morning Star, a club studded with iron spikes, could turn a man's head into an unrecognizable pulp. The billhook, originally a farming tool, could catch a mounted knight's leg and tear him from his horse, often taking the limb with it. The war scythe could disembowel multiple men with a single sweep. But perhaps most terrifying of all were the injuries caused by everyday weapons in the hands of desperate men. A simple dagger, when driven into the gap between helmet and gorget, could sever the spinal cord instantly. A mace blow to the knee could shatter the joint so completely that the leg would hang by skin alone. Even a wooden staff, when swung with enough force, could cave in a man's ribcage and puncture his lungs. The chaos of medieval battle meant that injuries came from every direction and in every conceivable way. Men were trampled by horses, crushed under falling comrades, or simply beaten to death by multiple attackers. The concept of a fair fight simply didn't exist. If you were down, your enemies would continue striking until you stopped moving entirely. What made these injuries even more horrific was the primitive state of medieval medicine. When a soldier sustained a wound on the battlefield, his chances of survival depended not on modern surgical techniques or antibiotics, but on the limited knowledge of barber surgeons who worked with tools that would make a modern doctor faint. These battlefield medics, often called barber surgeons, were part barber, part surgeon, and part torturer. They carried crude instruments, bone saws for amputation, iron cauterizing tools for sealing wounds, and leather straps for patients to bite down on during procedures. There was no anesthesia beyond strong alcohol, no understanding of infection control, and no concept of sterile technique. The most common treatment for severe limb injuries was immediate amputation. A skilled barber surgeon could remove a damaged arm or leg in under a minute, then spend another 3 to 4 minutes attempting to stop the bleeding using red-hot irons to cauterize the wound. The mortality rate for these amputations was around 39% for arms and lower legs, but jumped to 62% for high leg amputations. Those who survived amputation faced a lifetime of disability in an age when physical labor was essential for survival. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that some of these men actually returned to battle. Researchers have found skeletons showing healed amputation sites alongside fresh battle wounds, indicating that some warriors continued fighting even after losing limbs in previous conflicts. Arrow wounds presented their own unique medical challenges. Unlike sword cuts or blunt trauma, arrows often embedded themselves deep in the body, and removing them required delicate skill. Medieval surgeons developed specific techniques for arrow extraction, but the process was often more dangerous than leaving the arrow in place. The guidelines for arrow removal were surprisingly sophisticated. First, the surgeon had to examine the arrow's position, determine if it might be poisoned, assess the location of the wound, and check for contamination with dirt or debris. Then came the delicate process of extraction, which had to be done swiftly to minimize blood loss. Finally, the surgeon had to control hemorrhaging and prevent infection. The most famous case of successful arrow wound treatment occurred when the future King Henry V was struck at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. The 16-year-old prince took an arrow to the face that penetrated 6 inches into his head. The royal surgeon, John Bradmore, successfully removed the arrow using an innovative technique that involved gradually enlarging the wound with specially designed instruments. The young prince survived to become one of England's most celebrated warrior kings, though he bore the scars of that wound for the rest of his life. But for every success story like Henry V, There were thousands of soldiers who died agonizing deaths from infected wounds. Medieval medicine had no understanding of bacteria or the importance of sterile technique. Wounds were often treated with poultices made from animal dung, human urine, or rotting herbs. These treatments, intended to promote healing, often introduced deadly infections that killed patients days or weeks after they'd survived the initial trauma. The psychological toll of medieval warfare was just as devastating as the physical injuries. Soldiers who survived battles often carried mental scars that never healed. The constant exposure to extreme violence, the sounds of dying comrades, and the ever-present threat of death created a form of trauma that medieval society had no way to understand or treat. Head and facial wounds were particularly devastating, not just physically, but psychologically. In medieval society, facial scars were seen as marks of shame and dishonor. A warrior who survived a battle with a disfigured face might find himself unable to marry, unable to find work, and shunned by his community. Some chose suicide rather than live with such visible reminders of their battlefield experiences. The smell of a medieval battlefield lingered long after the fighting ended. Bodies would lie where they fell for days or even weeks, bloating in the sun and attracting clouds of flies. The stench was so overwhelming that chroniclers described it as being detectable from miles away. Survivors had to live and work in this environment while they searched for salvageable equipment and tended to the wounded. Disease spread rapidly through these conditions. Dysentery, typhoid, and plague could decimate an army faster than any enemy weapon. In many medieval conflicts, more soldiers died from disease than from combat injuries. The lack of sanitation, combined with contaminated water sources and poor nutrition, created perfect conditions for epidemics that could wipe out entire armies in a matter of weeks. This was the reality of medieval warfare, not the cleaned-up version we see in movies, but a brutal, chaotic nightmare that traumatized everyone who experienced it. And we've only just begun to scratch the surface of how dark and horrifying these battlefields really were. The chaos we've described so far was just the beginning, because once the initial clash ended and the dust began to settle, an entirely different kind of horror began to unfold. This is when the medieval battlefield revealed its most disturbing secrets, the ones that chroniclers often refused to write down and survivors rarely spoke about. Let's talk about what happened to the prisoners. In theory, medieval warfare operated under certain codes of conduct. The concept of ransom meant that captured nobles could expect to buy their freedom, and the rules of chivalry supposedly protected those who surrendered. But the reality on the ground was far more complicated and infinitely more brutal. Your fate as a prisoner depended entirely on who you were, who captured you, and what mood your captors happened to be in. If you were a knight or nobleman, you might indeed be treated with relative courtesy while your family scrambled to raise your ransom. But if you were a common soldier, a mercenary, or worse yet, a member of a despised ethnic or religious group, your prospects were grim beyond imagination. The ransom system, when it worked, was actually quite civilized. A captured lord might find himself housed in comfortable quarters, allowed to write letters to his family, and treated almost like a guest while negotiations proceeded. The son of the constable of Richmond Castle paid 200 marks for his freedom after his father's fortress fell in 1216. This was expensive, certainly, but it was business, not butchery. But this courtesy had strict limitations. King John, that notorious tyrant, demonstrated the darker side of medieval prisoner treatment when he ordered the massacre of captured archers during the siege of Rochester in 1215. These men were slaughtered not because they had fought bravely, but because of their social class. Archers were considered beneath the protection of chivalric codes, mere peasants with weapons. Pope Pius III had even condemned the use of bows in warfare, which gave John additional justification for his brutality. The treatment became even more savage when ethnic hatred entered the picture. When Welsh forces captured an English castle in 1212, every single prisoner was beheaded. This wasn't unusual behavior, it was retaliation. The English had been treating Welsh prisoners the same way, executing rather than ransoming them. What began as political conflict had degenerated into a cycle of ethnic cleansing that made medieval battlefields even more terrifying. But even systematic execution paled in comparison to what happened when prisoners were tortured for information. Medieval torture wasn't the random cruelty you might imagine. It was a sophisticated science with specific goals and carefully designed techniques. Captors wanted military intelligence. They wanted to increase ransom values through fear. They wanted to force the surrender of castles, and sometimes they simply wanted to break their enemies' morale by making examples of their captives. The methods were borrowed from multiple sources. Some techniques came directly from battlefield weapons, like using captured soldiers for target practice with arrows and lances, or amputating limbs with swords. Others were adapted from surgical procedures, turning medical knowledge into instruments of agony. Dismemberment, tooth extraction, and the flaying of skin alive were all documented practices. Then there were devices specifically designed for torture. The gibbet allowed captors to suspend prisoners in cages, leaving them exposed to the elements until they died of thirst or exposure. The pillory enabled public whipping that could continue for hours. Tight cords were wrapped around limbs until they cut off circulation, likely causing compartment syndrome that resulted in gangrene and death. The racks stretched prisoners until their joints dislocated and their bones snapped. The barnacles crushed legs and feet into shapeless pulp. During the Crusades, torture took on religious dimensions that added new layers of horror. Prisoners weren't just sources of information or ransom, they were heretics whose suffering pleased God. Devices like the Iron Maiden, though possibly more legend than fact, symbolized the willingness to abandon all moral constraints in pursuit of religious dominance. The line between faith and cruelty disappeared entirely as crusaders convinced themselves that inflicting pain on unbelievers was a holy act. The psychological impact of witnessing such torture was devastating for everyone involved, including the perpetrators. Soldiers who participated in or observed these sessions often suffered what we would now recognize as severe trauma. But in medieval society, there was no understanding of psychological wounds, no treatment for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Men simply had to live with the memories of what they had done or seen, and many turned to alcohol or violence as their only means of coping. Yet even torture and execution weren't the worst fate that could befall a medieval prisoner. That distinction belonged to those captured during siege warfare, where starvation and disease created conditions that pushed human behavior beyond all civilized boundaries. Sieges were wars of attrition that could last for months or even years. The attacking army would surround a fortified position and wait for the defenders to run out of food, water, or hope. But this waiting game created its own unique horrors that went far beyond simple military strategy. As supplies dwindled inside a besieged castle or city, commanders faced impossible choices. Should they maintain full rations for the soldiers while civilians starved? Should they expel non-combatants to conserve resources, knowing they would likely die outside the walls? Should they surrender honorably or fight to the last man? The psychological warfare employed during sieges was deliberately designed to break the defender's will. Attacking forces would publicly execute captured defenders where the besieged could see them. They would mutilate prisoners and display the results as warnings of what awaited those who continued to resist. They would catapult severed heads over the walls to demoralize the garrison and terrorize civilians. But perhaps most horrifying of all was the use of biological warfare. Medieval commanders understood that disease could be as deadly as any sword, and they weaponized this knowledge with calculated precision. They would contaminate water supplies by dumping dead animals, sewage, or decomposing bodies into wells and reservoirs. They would catapult diseased corpses over castle walls, turning the defenders' living quarters into breeding grounds for infection. The most notorious example of this biological warfare occurred during the siege of Kaffa in 1346, when Mongol forces catapulted plague-infected bodies into the city. The resulting outbreak may have contributed to the spread of the Black Death throughout Europe, ultimately killing between 45 and 60% of the continent's population over the following 4 years. Inside a besieged fortress, conditions deteriorated rapidly as the siege dragged on. Stagnant water became breeding grounds for typhoid and dysentery. Poor diet weakened immune systems, making inhabitants more susceptible to pneumonia and other infections. The constant stress of impending attack, combined with malnutrition and disease, created a powder keg of desperation and violence. When food became critically scarce, fortress commanders would begin expelling what they called surplus civilians. These were usually the old, the sick, women and children who couldn't contribute to the defense but still consumed precious resources. These unfortunates would be driven out of the gates and into no man's land between the fortress and the besieging army. Sometimes the attackers would allow these refugees to pass through their lines and escape, but more often they would refuse passage, trapping the expelled civilians between the two forces. Unable to return to the fortress and forbidden to leave the area, these people would slowly starve to death within sight of both armies. Their suffering was intended to demoralize the defenders and pressure them into surrender. The defenders themselves weren't immune to the psychological pressure. As conditions worsened inside the fortress, discipline would begin to break down. Soldiers would fight over scraps of food. Officers would hoard supplies while their men starved. Some would attempt to desert, only to be caught and executed as examples to others. The social order that held medieval society together would gradually collapse under the pressure of prolonged siege. Medical care during sieges was virtually non-existent. Wounded defenders couldn't be evacuated for proper treatment, and supplies of herbs and other medicinal materials would quickly run out. Men would die from infections that could have been easily treated under normal circumstances. The smell of gangrene and rotting flesh would permeate the fortress, adding to the psychological pressure on the surviving defenders. Even water, that most basic necessity of life, became a weapon of terror during medieval sieges. Attacking forces would divert rivers, poison wells, or simply wait for cisterns to run dry. Defenders reduced to drinking their own urine or the blood of slaughtered animals faced a choice between slow death by dehydration and quick death by surrender. The final assault on a fortress that had endured a long siege was often the most brutal phase of the entire conflict. Attackers who had spent months in uncomfortable field conditions, watching their comrades die from disease and enemy sorties, were in no mood for mercy when they finally breached the walls. The promise of plunder and revenge drove them to excesses that shocked even medieval chroniclers. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the sack that followed was so savage that it became legendary throughout Europe. Soldiers and civilians alike were slaughtered indiscriminately. Women were raped and murdered. Children were sold into slavery. Ancient churches were desecrated and their treasures looted. The psychological trauma of such events rippled through entire societies for generations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of siege warfare was how it changed the people who participated in it. Decent men, fathers and sons and brothers, would find themselves committing acts of cruelty that they never could have imagined in peacetime. The gradual erosion of moral boundaries, combined with the constant threat of death and the pressure to survive, created conditions that brought out the very worst in human nature. The records show that even the most disciplined armies could degenerate into murderous mobs once a siege ended. Officers who had maintained strict control during the siege would lose all authority once their men tasted victory and blood. The line between soldier and criminal would disappear entirely as the promise of plunder overwhelmed all other considerations. And yet, for all the horror and brutality of siege warfare, it remained a preferred method of medieval combat precisely because it was so effective at breaking enemy morale. The threat of starvation, disease, and ultimate massacre was often enough to convince defenders to surrender without a fight. The reputation for savagery that surrounded certain commanders and armies became a weapon in itself, causing enemies to flee rather than face the prospect of siege and its inevitable conclusion. This psychological dimension of medieval warfare extended far beyond individual battles or sieges. Entire regions would be terrorized by the mere approach of certain armies, their reputations preceding them like harbingers of doom. The knowledge that surrender offered no guarantee of safety, that mercy was rare and often conditional, that death might come through starvation, disease, or torture rather than clean combat, created a climate of fear that permeated medieval society. We're beginning to understand that the medieval battlefield wasn't just a place where armies met and fought. It was a nexus of human suffering, where all the darkest aspects of medieval life converged into something approaching hell on earth. And we haven't even begun to explore the diseases that swept through these killing fields, turning minor wounds into death sentences and transforming entire armies into walking corpses. The diseases that plagued medieval armies were as deadly as any weapon forged in a blacksmith shop, and infinitely more terrifying because they struck without warning, without honor, and without mercy. While we've explored the brutal injuries caused by swords and arrows, the invisible killers that swept through medieval battlefields claimed far more lives than all the weapons of war combined. Picture an army on the march, 20,000 men trudging across the countryside for weeks, their unwashed bodies pressed together in cramped conditions, sharing contaminated water sources and relieving themselves wherever convenient. No understanding of bacteria, no concept of hygiene beyond the occasional splash of cold water on the face. These weren't just military formations, they were mobile breeding grounds for every disease known to medieval Europe. Dysentery was perhaps the most common killer. This wasn't the mild stomach upset you might experience from bad food today. Medieval dysentery was a savage disease that could kill a healthy man in days. It began with severe abdominal cramps that would double a soldier over in agony. Then came the bloody diarrhea, so frequent and violent that men would lose all control of their bodily functions. The dehydration that followed was catastrophic, leaving once proud warriors as skeletal figures barely able to lift their weapons. The smell alone was enough to break morale. Imagine 20,000 men suffering from explosive diarrhea simultaneously, with no proper latrines, no clean water for washing, and no understanding that their waste was spreading the disease even further. Camp followers would wade through seas of human filth to tend to the sick, unknowingly carrying the infection from tent to tent, victim to victim. Typhoid fever was equally devastating, but more insidious in its approach. It would start slowly, almost gently, with what seemed like a minor fever and headache. Soldiers might continue fighting for days while the disease quietly destroyed their bodies from within. The characteristic rose-colored rash would appear on the chest and abdomen, followed by severe abdominal pain and high fever that could reach dangerous levels. But the real horror of typhoid was how it affected the mind. As the disease progressed, victims would become delirious, hallucinating enemies that weren't there, crying out for mothers who had died years earlier, or simply staring into space with vacant eyes while their bodies wasted away. Entire units could be rendered combat ineffective not by enemy action, but by men who had lost their minds to fever. The treatment for these diseases was worse than useless. Medieval physicians believed in the theory of the four humours, thinking that illness was caused by an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Their solution was bloodletting, deliberately weakening patients who were already dying from blood loss and dehydration. They would slice open veins with dirty knives or apply leeches to drain what they believed was corrupted blood, hastening death rather than preventing it. Pneumonia thrived in the cold, damp conditions of medieval military campaigns. Soldiers sleeping on frozen ground, wearing wet clothes for days at a time, breathing the smoke from countless campfires, would develop the telltale cough that marked the beginning of the end. The disease would fill their lungs with fluid, drowning them slowly from within while they remained conscious and aware of their fate. The sound of an army camp at night during a pneumonia outbreak was haunting beyond description. Thousands of men coughing simultaneously, some bringing up blood with each spasm, others gasping for air that wouldn't come. The wet, rattling breathing of the dying mixed with the moans of those still fighting the disease created a symphony of suffering that could be heard for miles. Medieval armies tried various remedies for respiratory ailments. They would burn herbs and have sick soldiers breathe the smoke, unknowingly making their lung conditions worse. They would force patients to drink concoctions made from animal urine, rotted vegetables, and ground-up insects. Some physicians recommended placing live chickens on the patient's chest to draw out the disease, a practice that accomplished nothing except adding animal parasites to the patient's list of problems. But even these diseases paled in comparison to the ultimate killer of medieval Europe, the bubonic plague. When the Black Death arrived on a medieval battlefield, it didn't just kill soldiers, it destroyed entire civilizations. This wasn't a disease that picked and chose its victims based on strength or social status. It killed indiscriminately, savagely, and with the efficiency that made military strategists weep with envy. The plague typically began with flu-like symptoms that soldiers might dismiss as battle fatigue, a slight fever, some aches and pains, nothing that couldn't be ignored in the heat of campaign. But within days, the characteristic buboes would appear, swollen lymph nodes the size of chicken eggs that protruded from the neck, armpits, and groin. These buboes were excruciatingly painful, so sensitive that even the touch of clothing could send victims into screaming fits. As the disease progressed, the buboes would turn black and begin to leak pus and blood. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of rotting flesh and sweet corruption that clung to everything it touched. Victims would develop high fevers that could reach 105 degrees Fahrenheit, causing delirium, convulsions, and eventually coma. The mortality rate was staggering. Of those who contracted bubonic plague, 4 out of 5 died within 8 days. But there were even worse forms of the disease. Septicemic plague attacked the bloodstream directly, causing massive internal bleeding and organ failure. Its mortality rate was 99 to 100%. Victims would literally bleed to death from the inside, their skin turning black as their blood vessels collapsed. Pneumonic plague was perhaps the most terrifying variant because it was directly contagious through airborne droplets. A single infected soldier coughing in a crowded tent could infect dozens of his comrades within hours. This form attacked the lungs, causing victims to cough up blood and infectious material while remaining conscious and aware until the very end. The psychological impact of plague outbreaks was devastating. Soldiers who had faced down charging cavalry without flinching would break down completely when the plague entered their camp. They knew that armor offered no protection, that courage meant nothing, that skill with weapons was useless against an enemy they couldn't see or fight. Medieval attempts to combat the plague revealed the desperate superstition of the age. Some believed it was divine punishment for sin and organized mass flagellation sessions where soldiers would whip themselves bloody, hoping to appease God's wrath. Others tried to outrun the disease by constantly moving, not understanding that they were simply spreading it to new areas. The remedies were both pathetic and horrifying. Physicians recommended drinking the pus from lance buboes, believing it would provide immunity. They suggested bathing in human urine or wearing amulets made from crushed emeralds. Some treatments involved roasting eggshells and grinding them into powder, mixing them with marigold flowers and treacle, then drinking the concoction in warm beer twice daily. Perhaps most tragically, they tried quarantine measures that were almost correct. Venice instituted 40-day isolation periods for suspected plague victims in 1348, creating the concept of quarantine from the Latin word for 40. But their understanding of disease transmission was so flawed that these measures often made outbreaks worse rather than better. The social breakdown that accompanied plague outbreaks was complete and terrifying. Military discipline would collapse as officers died alongside their men. Supply lines would fail as entire communities were wiped out. Soldiers would desert en masse, carrying the disease back to their home villages and spreading the epidemic even further. Some armies simply ceased to exist as fighting forces. The English army that laid siege to Calais in 1346 lost more men to plague than to French weapons. Entire companies would be reduced to a handful of survivors within weeks. Horses would stand untended as their riders died, eventually starving to death themselves as the epidemic consumed everything in its path. The stench of plague-ravaged armies was legendary. Contemporary chroniclers described it as detectable from distances of 10 miles or more. The smell of rotting flesh, infected buboes, and mass death would hang over battlefields like a poisonous cloud, warning approaching forces of the horror that awaited them. But disease wasn't the only invisible killer stalking medieval battlefields. Infection from wounds, something we can easily treat today with antibiotics, was a death sentence that could take weeks to execute. A minor sword cut that barely drew blood could become gangrenous within days, slowly consuming the victim's flesh while they remained fully conscious and aware of their fate. Gangrene was particularly horrifying because it was so visible. The infected flesh would turn black and begin to rot while still attached to the living body. The smell was so putrid that other soldiers would refuse to approach the victim. Maggots would infest the wound, eating away at dead tissue while the patient watched in horror. Medieval physicians understood that amputation might save the patient's life, but their techniques were crude beyond belief. They would tie tourniquets made from rope or leather strips, then hack through the infected limb with bone saws that were never cleaned between patients. The procedure was performed without anesthesia, while the patient was held down by multiple men. The cauterization process that followed amputation was its own form of torture. Red-hot irons would be pressed against the severed stump to seal blood vessels, filling the air with the smell of burning flesh and the screams of the patient. Many victims died from shock during this procedure, while others succumbed to infection in the days that followed. Those who survived battlefield amputations faced a lifetime of disability in a world that had no social safety net for the handicapped. Archaeological evidence shows that some of these men returned to combat despite their missing limbs, suggesting that warfare was their only means of survival, even after sustaining crippling injuries. The psychological toll of witnessing such medical procedures was severe for everyone involved. Soldiers would rather risk death from infection than submit to amputation, knowing that the cure might be worse than the disease. The sound of bone saws cutting through living tissue, the sight of limbs being tossed onto growing piles of severed body parts, the smell of cauterized flesh, all combined to create trauma that lasted long after the physical wounds had healed. Battlefield surgery was performed in conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. Operations took place in blood-soaked tents, using instruments that were never sterilized, by surgeons whose hands were caked with filth from previous patients. Cross-contamination was inevitable, turning minor procedures into death sentences for patients who might otherwise have recovered. The tools themselves were primitive and terrifying. Bone saws with teeth like those used for cutting wood, cauterizing irons that glowed red-hot in braziers filled with charcoal. Forceps for extracting arrow points that looked more like torture devices than surgical instruments. Leather straps for restraining patients who would thrash and scream throughout procedures performed without any form of pain relief. Arrow extraction was perhaps the most challenging procedure facing battlefield surgeons. Unlike modern bullets, which often pass cleanly through tissue, medieval arrows were designed to embed themselves deeply in their targets. The barbed heads would catch on bone and tissue, making removal extremely difficult and dangerous. Surgeons developed specialized techniques for different types of arrow wounds. For arrows lodged in bone, they would use instruments called arrow spoons to gradually widen the wound channel while carefully extracting the point. For arrows that had penetrated vital organs, They often had to make the difficult decision to leave the projectile in place rather than risk killing the patient during removal. The most challenging cases involved arrows that had been deliberately poisoned before battle. Medieval armies would coat arrowheads with various toxins, from snake venom to rotted animal matter, ensuring that even minor wounds would prove fatal. Surgeons had no effective treatments for such poisoning and could only watch helplessly as their patients died in agony. The survival rate for arrow wounds was appallingly low. Even minor hits could prove fatal if infection set in, or if the arrow had damaged vital blood vessels. Soldiers knew that being struck by an arrow often meant a slow, agonizing death, rather than the quick end they might prefer. Head wounds presented their own unique challenges for medieval surgeons. The primitive understanding of brain anatomy meant that any injury to the skull was likely to be fatal. Surgeons might attempt to remove bone fragments or drain blood from head injuries, but they had no understanding of intracranial pressure or brain function. The social stigma attached to facial wounds added psychological trauma to physical injury. In medieval society, a man's appearance was closely tied to his honor and social standing. A warrior who survived battle with a disfigured face might find himself unable to marry, unable to find employment, and shunned by his former comrades. Some soldiers chose suicide rather than live with severe facial scarring. Others became hermits, hiding from society rather than face the shame and disgust their appearance provoked. The psychological wounds inflicted by facial disfigurement often proved more devastating than the original physical injury. The primitive state of medieval dentistry meant that even minor mouth wounds could have serious consequences. A sword blow that knocked out teeth might seem minor compared to a severed limb, but the resulting infections could prove fatal. Abscessed teeth were common among medieval soldiers, causing excruciating pain and potentially deadly blood poisoning. Medieval battlefield medicine was hampered not just by lack of knowledge, but by religious beliefs that actively interfered with treatment. The Catholic Church taught that suffering was spiritually beneficial, leading some physicians to avoid pain relief even when it was available. Prayer was often considered more important than surgery, delaying treatment until it was too late to be effective. The concept of infection was completely foreign to medieval medical thinking. Surgeons saw no problem with using the same instruments on multiple patients without cleaning them, or with performing surgery with hands that hadn't been washed in weeks. They often made wounds worse by introducing additional contaminants during their attempts at treatment. Pain management was virtually non-existent beyond strong alcohol and occasionally opium-based preparations that were extremely rare and expensive. Patients undergoing surgery were expected to endure unimaginable agony while remaining conscious and aware throughout the procedure. The psychological trauma of such experiences often proved as devastating as the physical injuries themselves. The mortality rate for battlefield surgery was so high that many soldiers preferred to attempt self-treatment rather than submit to professional medical care. They would cauterize their own wounds with heated weapons, stitch cuts with whatever materials were available, or simply hope that their injuries would heal naturally. Those who did survive battlefield surgery often faced years of chronic pain from poorly healed wounds. Bones that had been set incorrectly would cause permanent disability. Severed nerves would leave entire limbs numb and useless. Scar tissue would restrict movement and cause constant discomfort. The long-term effects of medieval battlefield medicine created a population of disabled veterans who had no support system and no means of caring for themselves. Many ended up as beggars, displaying their war wounds to passers-by in hopes of earning sympathy and coins. Others turned to crime, using their military training for banditry and violence. The psychological impact of surviving medieval medical treatment was profound and lasting. Soldiers who had endured amputation without anesthesia, who had watched their own limbs being sawed off while they remained conscious, often suffered what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. These men would wake screaming from nightmares, reliving the moment when the bone saw bit into their flesh or when the red-hot iron sealed their wounds. They would flinch at sudden movements, unable to forget the helpless terror of being held down while surgeons worked on their bodies. Many turned to alcohol as their only escape from memories too horrible to bear. The families of these wounded veterans often suffered alongside them. Wives had to care for husbands who had been transformed from strong protectors into helpless invalids. Children grew up with fathers who were physically and emotionally broken by their battlefield experiences. The ripple effects of medieval warfare extended far beyond the battlefields themselves, poisoning entire communities with trauma and despair. Medieval society had no understanding of psychological wounds or mental health treatment. Soldiers who displayed what we now recognize as symptoms of PTSD were often seen as cowards or malingerers. Those who couldn't cope with their trauma were abandoned by their comrades and forgotten by their superiors. The combination of physical disability and psychological trauma created a lost generation of medieval veterans who were unable to reintegrate into civilian life. These men had been trained for nothing but warfare, but their injuries made them unfit for further military service. With no skills applicable to peacetime occupations and no social safety net to support them, many simply disappeared into the margins of medieval society. The medieval battlefield was revealing itself as something far more horrifying than a simple clash of arms. It was a nexus where all the worst aspects of medieval life, the disease, the primitive medicine, the casual brutality, the complete disregard for human suffering, converged into something that challenged the very definition of hell itself. And yet, for all the horror we've explored so far, we've only begun to understand the true depths of medieval battlefield savagery. Because when the fighting ended and the wounded were carried away, when the disease had run its course and the surgeons had finished their butchery, there remained one final act in this theatre of cruelty that would test the limits of human endurance and reveal just how far civilized men could fall when stripped of all restraint and mercy. The aftermath of medieval battles brought its own unique horrors that in many ways exceeded even the violence of combat itself. This is where we encounter the scavengers, both human and animal, who descended upon these killing fields like vultures upon carrion, and where the true cost of medieval warfare became apparent to anyone brave or foolish enough to witness it. When dawn broke over these fields of slaughter, the real horror show was just beginning. The clashing of weapons had fallen silent. The screams of the dying had faded to occasional whimpers. But the battlefield itself had transformed into something that defied every natural law of decay and decomposition. Picture walking across Agincourt 3 days after the battle ended in 1415. The ground beneath your feet wasn't solid earth anymore. It was a carpet of human remains so thick that you couldn't take a step without treading on someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother. Arms and legs jutted out at impossible angles from the mud. Torsos split open like overripe fruit, leaked their contents across the churned earth. Heads with their eyes pecked out by crows stared blindly at the grey English sky. The smell was beyond description. Imagine the worst thing you've ever smelled, then multiply that by 1,000 and add the sweet, cloying stench of blood that had been baking in the sun for days. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that the odour could be detected from more than 10 miles away, a wall of putrefaction that announced the battlefield long before you could see it. But the dead weren't alone on these killing fields. They shared their space with creatures that had grown fat and bold on human flesh. Rats the size of small dogs scurried between the corpses, their bellies distended from feasting on the fallen. They had learned to fear nothing, these battlefield rats. They would continue eating even when approached by living humans, so accustomed had they become to being the only moving things in their domain of death. The birds were even worse. Clouds of ravens and crows would descend like a black plague, their harsh cries the only sound breaking the terrible silence. They had their preferences, these scavengers. Eyes were always the first to go, plucked from skulls with surgical precision. Tongues were another delicacy, pulled from gaping mouths before the bodies had even finished cooling. The birds would perch on rib cages like grotesque sentinels, defending their meals from competitors with savage determination. Wolves became bolder as battles grew larger and more frequent. Packs would emerge from the forest within hours of combat ending, drawn by scents they had learned to associate with easy feeding. These weren't the half-starved creatures of fairy tales. These were well-fed predators who had grown strong on human flesh and learned to see men not as threats, but as providers of abundant meat. The transformation of these animals was disturbing to witness. Domestic dogs that had followed armies would revert to wild behavior within days of a major battle, forming packs that competed with wolves for the choicest portions of the dead. Horses that had lost their riders would sometimes be found days later, standing guard over their master's corpse, slowly starving rather than abandon the only human they had ever known. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the human scavengers who appeared as if summoned by some dark magic. These weren't soldiers or even proper camp followers. They were a breed unto themselves, creatures who had made careers out of profiting from death and suffering. They arrived in the wake of every major battle, like flies drawn to honey, men and women who had given up any pretense of normal human behavior, who saw corpses not as former people, but as sources of income. They moved through the killing fields with practiced efficiency, stripping bodies of anything valuable while the blood was still wet. Their techniques were horrifyingly systematic. Jewelry was pried from fingers that might still twitch with the last remnants of life. Gold teeth were extracted with pliers from mouths that had been speaking final words just hours earlier. Clothing was cut away from bodies with knives that didn't discriminate between fabric and flesh, leaving the dead naked and exposed to the elements. Weapons were particularly prized by these vultures. A good sword could feed a scavenger's family for months, assuming they had families, and weren't simply solitary creatures who lived entirely off the profits of war. They developed an eye for quality, these battlefield thieves. They could spot the difference between a knight's blade and a common soldier's weapon from across a field of corpses. Armor presented its own challenges and opportunities. The best pieces were often so damaged by the violence that had killed their wearers that they were worthless as protection. But the metal itself had value, and scavengers would spend hours cutting mail rings apart or prying plate segments free from bodies that were often still warm. The most disturbing aspect of this battlefield scavenging was how quickly the scavengers became desensitized to human suffering. They would step over men who were still alive, but too weak to resist, ignoring their pleas for water or help while they focused on looting the more obviously dead. Some survivors reported that scavengers would actually hasten the death of wounded soldiers who possessed particularly valuable equipment, slitting throats or smothering victims to speed up the harvesting process. Women were among the most efficient of these battlefield predators. They had developed techniques for quickly assessing which corpses were worth investigating and which could be passed over. They carried specialized tools, thin blades for cutting purse strings, small hammers for breaking fingers to remove rings, hooks for pulling chainmail apart. Their movements through the carnage were almost dance-like in their practiced precision. Children accompanied some of these scavenging parties, learning the family trade from an early age. These youngsters would crawl into spaces too small for adults, searching through piles of corpses for overlooked treasures. They learned to ignore the stench, to step confidently on human remains, to see death not as tragedy, but as opportunity. The psychological effect on these children was profound and lasting. Many grew up incapable of normal human empathy, having learned from infancy that other people's suffering was simply a fact of life to be exploited rather than alleviated. They formed a permanent underclass of battlefield parasites who followed armies across Europe, always ready to profit from the next massacre. Some scavengers specialized in particular types of loot. There were those who focused exclusively on weapons, others who sought only precious metals, still others who collected anything made of leather or cloth. The most macabre specialists were those who harvested human remains for various purposes. Hair was valuable for wig making. Teeth could be sold to dentists for making dentures, and certain body parts were believed to have medicinal or magical properties. The trade in human remains was surprisingly organized and profitable. Networks of dealers would purchase bones, organs, and other body parts from battlefield scavengers, then transport them to markets throughout Europe. Physicians would pay premium prices for fresh corpses to use in their studies, while alchemists sought specific organs for their experiments. Battlefield scavenging became so common that it actually influenced military tactics. Commanders learned to post guards over their own dead to prevent looting, but these guards could rarely cover entire battlefields. Some armies began the practice of deliberately mutilating their own dead to make them less attractive to scavengers, a practice that added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish situation. The legal status of battlefield scavenging was murky at best. Technically, looting the dead was theft, but enforcement was nearly impossible in the chaos that followed major battles. Some commanders would hang captured scavengers as examples, but more often, they would simply drive them away, knowing they would return as soon as the army moved on. The scavengers themselves developed their own crude codes of conduct. Certain types of corpses were considered off-limits by some groups. Priests and other religious figures were usually left unmolested, though this had more to do with superstition than respect. Women's bodies were often stripped more thoroughly than men's, as female clothing and jewelry were typically more valuable. The efficiency of these human vultures was remarkable and disturbing. A battlefield that might contain thousands of corpses could be stripped clean of anything valuable within days of the fighting ending. The scavengers worked in shifts, some operating during daylight hours, while others preferred the cover of darkness. They developed techniques for working by touch alone, able to identify valuable items even in complete darkness. Competition between scavenging groups could be fierce and violent. Territories would be established and defended with the same brutality that had created the corpses they were looting. Fights would break out over particularly rich finds, adding fresh bodies to battlefields that were already saturated with death. The most successful scavengers were those who arrived earliest after battles ended. They would sometimes position themselves just outside the range of combat, watching the fighting and preparing to move in the moment it concluded. Speed was essential, as the best loot would disappear quickly once the field was opened to general scavenging. Some scavengers formed partnerships with battlefield surgeons and other medical personnel. They would trade information about the locations of wounded soldiers in exchange for access to the belongings of those who died during treatment. This symbiotic relationship between those who profited from death and those who claimed to prevent it revealed the moral corruption that warfare brought to every aspect of medieval society. The psychological impact of this massive scavenging operation extended far beyond the scavengers themselves. Survivors who returned to battlefields days or weeks later to search for fallen comrades would find naked, mutilated corpses that were often unrecognizable. The knowledge that their friends and relatives had been treated like livestock, stripped and butchered for profit, added another layer of trauma to their already overwhelming grief. Families who came looking for their dead sons and fathers would often find nothing but bones and scraps of clothing. The scavengers had been so thorough that identification became impossible. Mass graves would be filled with anonymous remains, forever denying closure to those who had lost loved ones in battle. The religious implications of this desecration were severe in an age when proper burial was considered essential for salvation. The Catholic Church taught that the body would be resurrected on Judgment Day, making the mutilation and scattering of corpses a form of spiritual murder. Yet the Church was largely powerless to prevent battlefield scavenging, as the scavengers operated in areas beyond normal ecclesiastical authority. Some attempts were made to organize proper burial of battlefield dead, but these efforts were usually overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the carnage. The Battle of Towton in 1461 left an estimated 28,000 men dead in a single day. No medieval society had the resources to properly bury such numbers, especially when the bodies were scattered across miles of countryside, and many were mutilated beyond recognition. Mass graves became the standard solution, but even these were inadequate. Bodies would be stacked like cordwood in enormous pits, with little attempt at organization or identification. Lime would be scattered over the corpses to speed decomposition and reduce disease, but the process was still horrifically slow. Some mass graves would continue to emit putrid odours for years after they were sealed. The long-term environmental impact of these massive battlefields was severe and lasting. The soil itself became contaminated with decomposing organic matter, creating conditions that were hostile to plant growth for decades. Areas where major battles had been fought would remain barren long after the bones had been scattered by scavengers and the elements. Water sources near battlefields became polluted and dangerous to drink. Wells and streams would be contaminated by decomposing bodies and the waste products of scavenging animals. Entire communities would be forced to relocate to avoid the disease and contamination that surrounded major killing fields. The disease that spread from these battlefield charnel houses was devastating to surrounding populations. Plague, typhoid, and dysentery would radiate outward from the sites of major battles, carried by the very scavengers who had profited from the carnage. Medieval communities learned to fear not just the approach of armies, but the aftermath of their conflicts. Some battlefields became so notorious for disease and death that they were permanently abandoned. The ground itself was considered cursed, unfit for cultivation or habitation. These areas would remain empty for generations, slowly reverting to wilderness while local populations whispered stories of the horrors they had witnessed. The psychological scarring extended to entire regions. Communities that had experienced the aftermath of major battles would develop collective trauma that lasted for generations. Children would be warned away from certain areas, not because of any immediate physical danger, but because of the spiritual contamination that was believed to linger where so many had died violently. Folk tales and legends would grow around these cursed battlefields. Stories of ghostly armies that continued to fight their eternal wars, of voices calling out from mass graves, of animals that refused to graze on grass that had been fertilized with human blood. These stories served as psychological defenses, ways for traumatized populations to process experiences that exceeded their ability to understand or accept. The medieval battlefield had revealed itself as something far beyond a simple military encounter. It was a concentrated expression of everything that was brutal, chaotic, and inhumane about medieval society. The fighting itself was merely the beginning of a process of dehumanization that would continue long after the last sword had been sheathed and the final arrow had been fired. But even now, having explored the violence of combat, the primitive horror of battlefield medicine, the systematic torture of prisoners, the ravages of disease, and the degradation of human scavengers, we have still only glimpsed the surface of medieval battlefield reality. Because beneath all of these visible horrors lay something even more disturbing, the complete breakdown of every social structure and moral boundary that medieval society claimed to hold sacred. The battlefield was where civilization went to die, where knights abandoned chivalry, where priests forgot mercy, where ordinary men discovered their capacity for unimaginable cruelty. It was a place where the thin veneer of medieval civilization was stripped away to reveal the savage, terrified animals that lurked beneath the surface of every supposedly civilized human being. And in that revelation lay the ultimate secret of the medieval battlefield, that for all their talk of honor and God and righteous warfare, medieval Europeans had created a form of organized savagery that surpassed anything their supposedly barbaric ancestors had ever imagined. They had transformed war from a brutal but limited activity into a comprehensive assault on everything that made life worth living, a systematic destruction of hope, dignity, and humanity itself. The medieval battlefield was medieval Europe's truest expression of itself, a mirror that reflected not the noble ideals they claimed to embrace, but the dark reality of what they had actually become. And that reflection was more terrifying than any monster their nightmares had ever conjured, because it was real, and it was them. And it was everywhere their armies marched across the blood-soaked landscape of medieval Europe. The true horror of these killing fields wasn't just what happened there, but what they revealed about the society that created them and the people who participated in them. The medieval battlefield was where medieval civilization showed its true face, and that face was the stuff of nightmares that would haunt Europe for centuries to come. These battlefields had broken something fundamental in the fabric of medieval society, something that went far deeper than individual trauma or regional devastation. They had created a new kind of human being, one that existed in the spaces between civilization and savagery, forever changed by exposure to horrors that no previous generation had been forced to witness. The veterans who survived these killing fields weren't just physically scarred. They carried within them a knowledge that set them apart from everyone who hadn't walked through those rivers of blood and mountains of corpses. They had seen what human beings were truly capable of when all restraints were removed, and that knowledge burned in them like a poison that could never be purged. These men would return to their villages and towns as strangers in familiar places. They would sit in taverns, staring into their ale while other men boasted about battles they'd never fought and courage they'd never been tested to show. The veterans knew the difference between the songs and the reality, and that knowledge isolated them more completely than any physical wound ever could. Their families would welcome them home with joy and celebration. But the men who returned weren't the same ones who had marched away months or years earlier. Wives would find themselves sharing beds with hollow-eyed strangers who would wake screaming in the middle of the night, calling out names of dead comrades or begging for mercy from enemies who existed only in their nightmares. Children would approach their fathers with excitement and love, only to recoil from men who could no longer bear to be touched unexpectedly, who would flinch at sudden movements and reach for weapons that weren't there. The simple act of a child running toward them could trigger memories of young soldiers charging across blood-soaked fields, their faces bright with terror and determination before the arrows found them. These veterans had learned to kill with an efficiency that terrified even themselves. They had discovered that the human body could be destroyed in countless ways, that life could be ended with shocking ease, that the difference between a living person and a corpse was often nothing more than a moment's inattention or a single poorly placed step. But more disturbing still was what they had learned about themselves. Men who had considered themselves decent, moral, God-fearing Christians had found themselves capable of acts that would have sickened them beyond measure in peacetime. They had tortured prisoners for information, had killed wounded enemies rather than tend to their injuries, had stood by while comrades committed atrocities that violated every principle they claimed to hold sacred. The knowledge of their own capacity for evil was perhaps the heaviest burden these veterans carried. They had looked into the abyss of human nature and found that it was looking back at them through their own eyes. They had become monsters, and the worst part was understanding that they had always possessed the potential for monstrosity. The battlefield had simply provided the circumstances that allowed it to flourish. Some tried to find redemption through religion, spending hours on their knees in cold stone churches, praying for forgiveness for sins so terrible they couldn't speak them aloud, even in confession. Priests would listen to their whispered admissions of guilt and offer absolution, but the words felt hollow to men who had seen the face of hell and recognized it as their own reflection. Others turned to drink, seeking oblivion in wine and ale that could temporarily drown the voices of the dead that echoed constantly in their minds. They would drink until they passed out, hoping for dreamless sleep, only to wake with the same memories intact and the same guilt gnawing at their souls like a cancer that could never be cut out. Many simply disappeared. They would walk away from their families, their homes, their entire lives, seeking some place where the ghosts couldn't follow them. They became wanderers, hermits, men who lived on the edges of civilization because they could no longer bear to be around normal people who still believed in goodness and justice and the possibility of redemption. The truly broken ones would seek out new wars, new battles, new opportunities to lose themselves in violence. They had become addicted to the chaos and brutality that had destroyed them, finding that the only time they felt truly alive was when death surrounded them on all sides. These men became professional killers, mercenaries who would fight for any cause that would pay them and provide them with the violence they craved. Medieval society had no framework for understanding or treating what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. These men were seen as either heroes to be celebrated or cowards to be shunned, with no middle ground for the complex reality of their condition. Those who couldn't function were often cast out entirely, left to beg or steal or simply waste away in the margins of a world that had no use for broken soldiers. The economic impact of this psychological devastation was enormous, but largely invisible. Entire regions would lose their most capable men not to death in battle, but to the lingering effects of battlefield trauma that made them unfit for normal labor. Farms would go untended, crafts would be abandoned, families would fall into poverty as their providers struggled with demons that no one else could see or understand. The social fabric of medieval communities was stretched to the breaking point by the constant influx of traumatized veterans who could no longer participate fully in civilian life. Traditional hierarchies would break down as men who had held positions of respect and authority found themselves unable to make simple decisions or maintain basic relationships. The corruption of violence spread like a contagion through medieval society. Children who grew up around traumatized veterans would absorb their cynicism and brutality, learning to see violence as the ultimate solution to all problems. Women who had lived through the aftermath of battles would develop their own forms of psychological armor, becoming harder and more callous in their dealings with others. The very language of medieval society began to change as battlefield experiences became more common and more extreme. New words had to be invented to describe injuries and acts of violence that previous generations had never encountered. The vocabulary of suffering expanded to accommodate horrors that had once been literally unthinkable. Religious institutions struggled to maintain their authority in the face of widespread evidence that God either didn't exist or didn't care about human suffering. Men who had prayed desperately for divine intervention while their comrades were being slaughtered around them found it difficult to maintain faith in a benevolent deity. The Church's teachings about mercy and forgiveness seemed naive and irrelevant to people who had witnessed the depths of human cruelty. The concept of chivalry, which was supposed to govern the conduct of medieval warriors, became increasingly hollow as the reality of warfare grew more brutal. Knights who were supposed to protect the innocent and show mercy to their enemies found themselves participating in or witnessing acts of savagery that made a mockery of their supposed code of honor. The gap between the idealized version of medieval warfare, promoted by poets and chroniclers, and the hideous reality experienced by actual participants grew so wide that it created a fundamental dishonesty at the heart of medieval culture. Everyone knew that the songs and stories were lies, but they continued to perpetuate them because the truth was too terrible to acknowledge. This cultural schizophrenia had profound effects on medieval art and literature. Works that attempted to deal honestly with the reality of warfare were suppressed or ignored, while romanticized fantasies were celebrated and promoted. The result was a society that became increasingly disconnected from its own reality, living in a world of comfortable lies, while the truth festered beneath the surface like an untreated wound. The political implications were equally severe. Rulers who sent their subjects off to die in these hellish conflicts found it increasingly difficult to maintain the loyalty and respect of their people. The social contract that bound medieval society together began to fray as ordinary people realized that their supposed protectors were perfectly willing to sacrifice them for political or economic advantage. Rebellions and uprisings became more common as traumatized veterans turned their military skills against the very system that had created their suffering. These men knew how to fight, how to kill, and how to organize for violence. When they finally decided that their rulers were their enemies, the results were catastrophic for the established order. The rise of mercenary companies composed entirely of battle-hardened veterans created a new form of organized violence that operated outside all traditional social controls. These groups had no loyalty to any nation or cause beyond their own survival and profit. They would fight for anyone who could pay them, switching sides without shame or hesitation when better offers appeared. These mercenary bands became roving armies of psychological invalids who sustained themselves through organized brutality. They would descend on defenseless communities like swarms of locusts, taking what they wanted and destroying what they couldn't use. Their leaders were often men who had been so completely broken by their battlefield experiences that they had lost all capacity for normal human emotion. The impact on medieval women was particularly devastating, though it's often overlooked in historical accounts. Wives and mothers had to deal not only with the physical absence of their men during campaigns, but with the psychological absence of those who returned. Many women found themselves essentially widowed by men who were still technically alive, but no longer capable of normal relationships. The children born to these unions often inherited their father's trauma in various forms. Some were raised by men who were emotionally absent or explosively violent. Others grew up in households where the unspoken horror of battlefield experiences created an atmosphere of constant tension and fear. Many learned that violence was the normal state of human existence, and that peace was merely a temporary pause between conflicts. The generational transmission of battlefield trauma created cycles of violence that would persist for centuries. Each new war would recruit men who had been raised in households poisoned by the psychological aftermath of previous conflicts. These recruits would bring their inherited trauma with them to new battlefields, where it would be amplified and concentrated before being carried back to contaminate new families and communities. Medieval medicine's complete inability to understand or treat psychological wounds meant that this trauma would accumulate over generations, like a poison that could never be purged from the social system. Each major conflict would add new layers of damage to populations that were still struggling to recover from previous wars. The economic costs of this psychological devastation were staggering, but largely uncounted. Entire regions would see their productivity collapse as their workforce became increasingly composed of men who were physically present but psychologically absent. Agricultural output would decline, craftsmanship would deteriorate, and trade would suffer as traumatized populations turned inward and became suspicious of outsiders. The demographic impact was equally severe, but less visible than battlefield casualties. Men who were too psychologically damaged to form normal relationships would often remain unmarried, removing themselves from the gene pool and reducing population growth. Those who did marry often proved to be violent or neglectful husbands and fathers, creating family environments that were hostile to child rearing. The intellectual and cultural development of medieval society was stunted by the constant drain of its most capable men into conflicts that left them psychologically destroyed. Potential scholars, artists, and innovators would be transformed into hollow-eyed killers who could contribute nothing to civilization beyond their capacity for violence. The rise of what we might call battlefield culture began to influence all aspects of medieval life. The values and attitudes that were necessary for survival on killing fields gradually infiltrated civilian society, making it more brutal, more suspicious, and more accepting of violence as a solution to problems. Children's games began to reflect the realities of warfare rather than the idealized versions promoted by official culture. Young boys would play at torture and execution rather than noble combat, incorporating techniques and attitudes they had absorbed from traumatized veterans in their communities. The treatment of animals became more cruel as people who had been desensitized to human suffering found it increasingly easy to ignore the pain of creatures they considered even less important. The casual brutality that characterized medieval attitudes toward animals was partly a reflection of the psychological numbing that resulted from exposure to battlefield horrors. Even religious practices were corrupted by the influence of battlefield trauma. The emphasis on suffering and martyrdom that characterized medieval Christianity took on new meanings for people who had witnessed or participated in the systematic torture and murder of their fellow human beings. Religious art became more graphic and disturbing as artists struggled to create images that could still shock audiences who had become accustomed to real-world horrors. The legal system began to reflect battlefield values as well. Punishments became more severe and more public as societies that had been brutalized by warfare demanded increasingly graphic demonstrations of justice. The line between legal punishment and sadistic torture became increasingly blurred as judges and executioners who had been shaped by battlefield experiences brought their military attitudes to civilian law enforcement. The very concept of mercy began to disappear from medieval culture as exposure to battlefield realities convinced people that showing weakness or compassion was a luxury that could lead to death. The idea that enemies could be reformed or that conflicts could be resolved through negotiation seemed naive and dangerous to populations that had learned to see every interaction as a potential life or death struggle. Trade relationships became more exploitative and predatory as merchants who had been exposed to battlefield culture applied military thinking to commercial activities. The notion of mutually beneficial exchange gave way to zero-sum thinking that saw every transaction as a conflict in which one party had to lose for the other to win. Marriage customs evolved to reflect the reality that many potential husbands were psychologically damaged goods who might prove to be violent or unreliable partners. Families began to prioritize physical security over emotional compatibility when arranging marriages, seeking men who could provide protection, even if they were incapable of providing love or companionship. Educational systems, such as they were, began to emphasize practical skills for survival in a violent world, rather than intellectual or artistic development. Children were taught to fight, to endure pain, and to distrust outsiders, rather than to read, write, or think creatively. The architecture of medieval communities reflected these changes as well. Towns and cities became more heavily fortified, not just against external enemies, but against the possibility of internal violence from traumatized populations that might turn destructive without warning. Public spaces were designed to facilitate crowd control rather than community gathering. The very landscape of medieval Europe was transformed by the psychological aftermath of battlefield trauma. Entire regions became militarized zones where normal civilian life was impossible, where every interaction was colored by the assumption that violence might erupt at any moment. The cumulative effect of all these changes was the creation of a civilization that was fundamentally different from what had existed before the great age of medieval warfare. This wasn't just a matter of technological or political evolution. It represented a fundamental shift in human consciousness, a rewiring of the collective psyche that would have lasting effects on European culture for centuries to come. Medieval Europe had become addicted to violence in ways that went far beyond simple political or economic motivations for warfare. The society had developed a psychological dependence on conflict that made peace seem unnatural and threatening. Periods without war were seen not as blessed respites from suffering, but as ominous calm before inevitable storms. This addiction to violence created a self-perpetuating cycle that would trap medieval Europe in an endless succession of conflicts. Each war would produce a new generation of traumatized veterans who would be psychologically compelled to seek out new conflicts. The society had created a machine for producing broken men who could only function in environments of extreme violence. The most disturbing aspect of this transformation was how completely it had been normalized. The generation that came of age during the height of medieval warfare accepted levels of brutality and suffering that would have horrified their ancestors. What had once been seen as aberrant behavior became routine, and what had once been considered horrific became mundane. The medieval battlefield had succeeded in doing something that no previous form of warfare had accomplished. It had fundamentally altered human nature itself, creating a new kind of person who was adapted to environments of extreme violence, but increasingly incapable of functioning in peaceful circumstances. These weren't just individual tragedies, though they certainly were that. This was a species-level transformation, a rewiring of human consciousness that would have effects far beyond the medieval period itself. The psychological patterns established by medieval battlefield trauma would echo through European culture for centuries, influencing everything from colonial expansion to modern warfare to the treatment of indigenous populations around the world. The medieval battlefield had become a factory for producing a new kind of human being, one that was optimized for violence and destruction, but increasingly incapable of creation or cooperation. And the most terrifying part was that this transformation was largely irreversible. Once a society had crossed that threshold, once it had produced enough traumatized individuals to reach critical mass, there was no going back to the way things had been before. The dark secrets of the medieval battlefield weren't just about what happened to individual soldiers or even individual battles. They were about what happened to human civilization itself when it was subjected to levels of organized violence that exceeded the capacity of the human psyche to process or integrate. Medieval Europe had conducted an experiment on itself, testing the limits of how much brutality a society could absorb before it fundamentally changed into something else entirely. The results of that experiment were still unfolding centuries later as the psychological patterns established on medieval battlefields continued to shape human behavior in ways that most people never realized or understood. The medieval battlefield had revealed something about human nature that perhaps should have remained hidden. It had shown that under the right circumstances, with sufficient pressure and the proper environment, ordinary people could be transformed into creatures capable of unimaginable cruelty. And once that transformation had occurred on a large enough scale, it became self-sustaining, creating a culture that would continue to produce such creatures long after the original pressures had been removed. This was the ultimate dark secret of the medieval battlefield, not just what it had done to the men who fought there, but what it had done to the entire concept of human civilization. It had proven that the thin veneer of culture and morality that separated humans from animals was far thinner than anyone had ever imagined, and that under sufficient stress, that veneer would not just crack, but completely dissolve, revealing something underneath that was far more terrible than anyone had ever dared to contemplate. The medieval battlefield had created something that went beyond individual trauma or even collective suffering. It had manufactured an entire worldview, a way of seeing and interpreting reality that was fundamentally different from anything that had existed before. This wasn't just about soldiers coming home changed. This was about entire civilizations being rewired at the most basic level of human understanding. Consider what happened when these traumatized veterans became the teachers, the craftsmen, the merchants, the priests of their communities. They didn't just carry their wounds silently. They transmitted their altered understanding of reality to everyone around them. A blacksmith who had seen a man's skull split like a melon would approach his craft differently, understanding metal and force in ways that peacetime smiths never could. A priest who had administered last rites on a battlefield, where the screams of the dying mixed with the laughter of looters, would deliver sermons with a darkness that could chill congregations to their bones. The children who grew up in these communities absorbed this transformed worldview like sponges. They learned that violence wasn't an aberration, but the fundamental organizing principle of existence. They understood from their earliest years that death could come suddenly, brutally, and without meaning. These lessons shaped how they approached every aspect of life, from choosing marriage partners to conducting business to raising their own children. But the most insidious aspect of this transformation was how it changed people's relationship with truth itself. The gap between the official stories about warfare and the reality experienced by participants created a deep cynicism about all forms of authority and communication. If the church could lie about the nobility of crusading, if kings could lie about the glory of battle, if chroniclers could lie about the honor of knighthood, then what else was false? This erosion of trust in traditional sources of meaning and authority created a spiritual vacuum that would be filled by increasingly dark and nihilistic philosophies. The concept of divine justice became laughable to people who had witnessed the random cruelty of battlefield death. The idea of earthly justice seemed equally absurd to those who had seen war criminals rewarded with titles and lands, while their victims rotted in unmarked graves. Medieval art began to reflect this transformation in subtle but profound ways. Religious paintings that had once depicted serene saints and gentle martyrdoms started showing increasingly graphic scenes of torture and suffering. Illuminated manuscripts began featuring marginalia filled with grotesque creatures and violent imagery that would have been unthinkable in earlier periods. The very architecture of medieval Europe was transformed by this new understanding of human nature. Castles became more complex and sophisticated, but also more cruel in their defensive features. Murder holes weren't just practical defensive measures. They reflected a mentality that saw killing as an art form worthy of architectural innovation. The elaborate torture chambers built into many medieval fortifications weren't just tools of interrogation. They were expressions of a culture that had come to see suffering as entertainment. Trade relationships evolved to reflect this new reality as well. Merchants who dealt in weapons developed increasingly sophisticated knowledge of what kinds of injuries different designs would inflict. Armorers competed not just on the basis of protection offered, but on the psychological impact their creations would have on enemies. The market for instruments of torture and execution became increasingly refined and specialized. Even the food culture of medieval Europe was affected by battlefield experiences. Soldiers who had been forced to eat rotting meat and drink contaminated water developed tolerances for flavors and textures that would have sickened their ancestors. When they returned home, their altered palates influenced local cuisine, leading to the acceptance of preservation techniques and flavor combinations that reflected the necessities of campaign life. The linguistic changes that occurred during this period weren't just about new vocabulary for describing violence. The very structure of medieval languages began to reflect the psychological patterns established by battlefield trauma. Sentence structures became more fragmented and disconnected. Metaphors drawn from warfare began to dominate all areas of discourse. Even romantic poetry started employing military imagery to describe love and courtship. The legal systems of medieval Europe underwent fundamental changes as well. Laws became more detailed and specific about different types of violence, reflecting a society that had become expert in distinguishing between various forms of brutality. Punishments became more elaborate and public, designed not just to deter crime, but to satisfy populations that had become accustomed to witnessing extreme suffering. The concept of evidence in legal proceedings was also transformed by battlefield experiences. Courts began to rely more heavily on physical proof rather than witness testimony, reflecting a deep skepticism about human honesty that had been learned in military contexts, where deception was essential for survival. The idea that truth could be determined through ordeal or combat became more popular as societies lost faith in rational methods of establishing facts. Marriage customs evolved in ways that reflected the new realities of medieval life. Betrothal ceremonies began to emphasize the potential for violence and loss rather than celebrating love and partnership. Wedding vows were modified to acknowledge the likelihood that one partner would die violently before the union could be completed naturally. Dowry negotiations increasingly focused on compensation for potential war widowhood, rather than establishment of new households. The treatment of children was fundamentally altered by these changes. Child-rearing practices that had once emphasized protection and nurturing were replaced by methods designed to prepare young people for lives of violence and hardship. Children were deliberately exposed to graphic displays of suffering and death, not out of cruelty, but from a genuine belief that such exposure was necessary preparation for adult life. Educational systems, such as they were, began to prioritize practical skills for surviving in violent environments over intellectual or artistic development. Literacy rates actually declined in some regions as families decided that teaching children to read was less important than teaching them to fight, hide, or endure pain without breaking. The role of women in medieval society was dramatically affected by these changes as well. Women who had once been protected from direct exposure to violence found themselves thrust into roles that required them to witness, participate in, or clean up after acts of extreme brutality. Many developed their own forms of psychological armor, becoming harder and more callous in their dealings with others. Some women became active participants in the violence itself, taking on roles as torturers, executioners, or military commanders that would have been unthinkable in earlier periods. Others retreated into religious mysticism, seeking spiritual explanations for suffering that rational thought could no longer provide. Still others developed forms of mental illness that allowed them to dissociate from realities too horrible to process consciously. The relationship between the living and the dead was fundamentally altered by battlefield experiences. Traditional funeral rites and mourning practices became inadequate for dealing with the scale and brutality of battlefield deaths. New rituals had to be developed to accommodate the reality that many dead would never be recovered, identified, or properly buried. Beliefs about the afterlife were modified to reflect the new understanding of how violent and meaningless death could be. The concept of purgatory became more elaborate and detailed, as theologians struggled to explain how souls that had died in extreme violence could be reconciled with a just and loving God. Some began to question whether such reconciliation was even possible. The veneration of saints took on new characteristics as well. Saints who had died peaceful deaths were gradually replaced in popular devotion by those who had suffered extreme torture or violence. The cult of martyrdom became more graphic and detailed, reflecting populations that had become desensitized to ordinary forms of suffering. Religious art began to feature increasingly detailed depictions of hell and damnation, not because artists had become more morbid, but because their audiences had developed a more sophisticated understanding of what real suffering looked like. The fires and demons of medieval hell paintings weren't fantasy. They were attempts to create spiritual imagery that could still shock people who had witnessed actual atrocities. The practice of pilgrimage was transformed by these changes as well. Pilgrimage routes that had once been peaceful spiritual journeys became gauntlets of violence and danger. Pilgrims began to travel in armed groups, carrying weapons and expecting to fight for their lives. The spiritual benefits of pilgrimage became associated with the suffering endured during the journey rather than with the destination itself. Monasteries and convents found themselves forced to adapt to the new realities as well. Many became fortified compounds that could withstand military attack. Monks and nuns who had once devoted themselves to prayer and contemplation found themselves learning military skills and weapons handling. The rule of Saint Benedict had to be modified to accommodate the reality that religious communities might need to defend themselves violently. The intellectual life of medieval Europe was stunted by these changes in ways that would have lasting effects on human development. Universities that might have become centers of learning and innovation instead became training grounds for military engineers and weapons designers. Scholarly pursuits that didn't have direct military applications were abandoned or suppressed. The development of science and technology was channeled almost exclusively toward military purposes. Innovations in metallurgy were directed toward creating better weapons and armor, rather than improving agricultural tools or household implements. Mathematical advances were applied to siege engineering rather than navigation or commerce. Medical knowledge, such as it was, became focused almost entirely on treating battle wounds rather than understanding human health more broadly. Physicians who might have made breakthrough discoveries about anatomy or disease instead spent their careers learning increasingly sophisticated techniques for amputation and wound cauterization. The artistic achievements of medieval Europe were similarly constrained by the militarization of society. Sculptors who might have created beautiful decorative works instead carved increasingly elaborate depictions of violence and suffering. Painters who might have explored new techniques for depicting light and beauty instead perfected methods for showing blood and gore in realistic detail. Musical composition was affected as well. The complex harmonies and sophisticated structures that had characterized earlier medieval music gave way to simpler forms that could be performed by soldiers around campfires or in the intervals between battles. The subtlety and nuance of courtly music was replaced by martial rhythms and militant themes. Literature underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. The romantic epics and spiritual allegories that had dominated earlier periods were replaced by increasingly graphic accounts of military campaigns and battles. Poetry that had once celebrated love and beauty instead focused on death and destruction. The very concept of the hero was redefined to emphasize capacity for violence rather than moral virtue. The oral tradition was similarly affected. Folk tales that had once taught moral lessons through gentle parables were replaced by stories that prepared listeners for lives of violence and brutality. Children's songs became marching chants. Lullabies incorporated themes of death and warfare. Even the calendar and seasonal celebrations were militarized. Religious holidays were increasingly associated with military victories rather than spiritual observances. Harvest festivals became recruitment opportunities. Wedding celebrations incorporated military displays and mock battles. The transformation of medieval European consciousness wasn't just about individual psychology or even social structures. It represented a fundamental shift in what it meant to be human. The capacity for empathy, cooperation, and creative expression that had characterized earlier human societies was systematically suppressed in favor of traits that were useful for surviving and participating in extreme violence. This wasn't an evolutionary adaptation in any meaningful sense. It was a kind of psychological mutation induced by environmental pressures that exceeded the normal range of human experience. Like radiation poisoning, the effects weren't immediately fatal, but accumulated over time to create changes that were ultimately incompatible with healthy functioning. The most disturbing aspect of this transformation was how completely it had been internalized by the affected populations. People didn't see themselves as victims of a systematic process of dehumanization. They saw themselves as having been awakened to the true nature of reality. They believed they had shed naive illusions about human nature and discovered hard truths that their ancestors had been too weak to acknowledge. This sense of superiority and enlightenment made the transformation self-perpetuating. Each new generation that was raised in this militarized environment saw itself as more realistic and practical than previous generations. They actively sought to eliminate what they saw as weakness and sentimentality from their culture, accelerating the process of psychological mutation. The result was a civilization that had become fundamentally incompatible with human flourishing. Medieval Europe had created social structures and cultural patterns that could sustain themselves only through the continuous production of violence and suffering. Peace became literally unthinkable because the society had restructured itself around the assumption that conflict was permanent and inevitable. This wasn't just about political or economic systems. It was about the basic cognitive and emotional patterns that shaped how people understood themselves and their world. Medieval Europeans had rewired their own brains to prioritize survival in violent environments over all other considerations. They had become, in a very real sense, a different species from their ancestors. The implications of this transformation extended far beyond the medieval period itself. The psychological patterns established by medieval battlefield culture would persist long after the specific military technologies and political structures that had created them became obsolete. The capacity for systematic violence and the comfort with extreme suffering that had been normalized during this period would continue to influence European behavior for centuries to come. Colonial expansion, the slave trade, religious persecution, and eventually industrial warfare would all be facilitated by the psychological changes that had been established during the medieval period. The same mental patterns that had allowed medieval Europeans to participate in or tolerate extreme battlefield violence would later enable them to participate in or tolerate other forms of systematic brutality. The medieval battlefield had been more than just a military phenomenon. It had been a laboratory for testing the limits of human adaptability to extreme environments. The results of those experiments had permanently altered the trajectory of human development, creating new forms of consciousness that were optimized for violence, but increasingly incapable of the cooperation and creativity that had characterized earlier human achievements. The dark secrets of the medieval battlefield weren't just about what had happened to individual soldiers or even individual societies. They were about what had happened to the human species itself when subjected to levels of organized violence that exceeded its evolutionary capacity to process and integrate. Medieval Europe had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return, creating new forms of human consciousness that would shape the trajectory of world history for centuries to come. The battlefield had revealed that the qualities that made humans capable of civilization, empathy, cooperation, creativity, trust, were far more fragile than anyone had ever imagined. Under sufficient pressure, these qualities didn't just disappear. They were actively replaced by their opposites, creating human beings who were not just capable of extreme violence, but dependent on it for their psychological well-being. This was the ultimate horror of the medieval battlefield. Not just that it had killed millions of people, but that it had transformed the survivors into creatures that could only function in environments of violence and suffering. It had created a self-perpetuating cycle of brutality that would continue long after the specific conditions that had originally produced it had ceased to exist. The medieval battlefield had succeeded in doing something that no previous form of warfare had accomplished. It had fundamentally altered human nature itself, creating new forms of consciousness that were adapted to extreme violence but increasingly incapable of peace. And the most terrifying part was that this transformation had been largely irreversible, creating patterns of thought and behavior that would echo through human history for centuries to come. In the end, the dark secrets of the medieval battlefield weren't just about the past. They were about the future that had been created by those killing fields, a future in which the capacity for systematic violence had become permanently embedded in human consciousness, waiting to be activated whenever the right conditions presented themselves. The medieval battlefield had planted seeds of destruction that would continue to bear fruit long after the last night had fallen and the last castle had crumbled to dust. These psychological mutations weren't confined to the soldiers themselves. They spread through medieval society like an invisible plague, infecting every institution and every relationship. The church, which was supposed to provide moral guidance and spiritual comfort, found itself increasingly complicit in the very brutality it claimed to condemn. Priests who had blessed weapons before battles, who had granted absolution to men about to commit mass murder, who had proclaimed that God favored their particular army over the enemy's, discovered that they could no longer maintain the fiction of moral authority. The gap between Christian teaching and Christian practice had grown so wide that it created a kind of spiritual schizophrenia within the church itself. Some clergy embraced this contradiction openly, developing elaborate theological justifications for violence that would have shocked earlier generations of Christians. They created new categories of holy war, righteous slaughter, and divine vengeance that transformed murder into sacrament and torture into prayer. The Crusades weren't just military campaigns. They were systematic attempts to reconcile Christianity with the reality of systematic brutality. But for every priest who found ways to justify the violence, there was another who was quietly driven insane by the contradictions. These men would retreat into mysticism or madness, unable to reconcile what they had witnessed with what they had been taught to believe. Some became hermits, fleeing to remote monasteries where they could avoid confronting the reality of what their faith had become. Others simply broke down completely, their minds shattered by the impossibility of maintaining belief in a loving God while participating in or witnessing systematic atrocities. The legal systems of medieval Europe underwent similar transformations. Laws that had been designed to maintain order and protect the innocent were gradually modified to accommodate and legitimize increasingly extreme forms of violence. Trial by combat wasn't just a legal procedure, it was a reflection of a society that had come to believe that might literally made right. Torture became not just accepted, but legally mandated in many jurisdictions. The rack, the wheel, the Iron Maiden, these weren't aberrations created by sadistic individuals. They were official instruments of justice, designed and built by craftsmen who took pride in their work, and sanctioned by legal codes that treated extreme suffering as a legitimate tool of governance. The concept of proportional punishment disappeared entirely from many medieval legal systems. Minor crimes might be punished with mutilation or death, not because the punishment fit the crime, but because societies that had become accustomed to battlefield levels of violence found it impossible to take lesser forms of transgression seriously. When you've seen men disemboweled for wearing the wrong colours, it becomes difficult to get excited about someone stealing a loaf of bread. Judges and magistrates who had been exposed to battlefield culture brought military thinking to civilian law enforcement. They began to see every legal proceeding as a kind of warfare with winners and losers rather than seekers after truth and justice. The adversarial system wasn't just a legal innovation. It was a reflection of societies that had learned to see every human interaction as a potential conflict. The economic systems of medieval Europe were similarly corrupted by battlefield values. Trade relationships that had once been based on mutual benefit and trust were replaced by zero-sum thinking that saw every transaction as a form of warfare. Merchants began to adopt military tactics in their business dealings, using deception, intimidation, and violence as standard commercial practices. The craft guilds that had once been cooperative organizations dedicated to maintaining quality and training apprentices were transformed into quasi-military organizations that used violence to eliminate competition and maintain market dominance. Guild wars weren't just economic disputes. They were armed conflicts that employed the same tactics and caused the same casualties as military campaigns. Banking and finance became increasingly predatory as institutions that had been exposed to battlefield culture began to see their customers as enemies to be defeated rather than partners to be served. The concept of usury was redefined to allow increasingly exploitative practices that would have been considered immoral in earlier periods. The very notion of contract and obligation was corrupted by military thinking. Agreements that had once been seen as mutual commitments became weapons to be used against the other party. Legal documents were drafted like battle plans, designed to trap and destroy rather than clarify and protect. Agricultural practices were affected as well. Farmers who had been traumatized by military service returned to their fields with altered relationships to the land and to the animals under their care. They began to treat farming as a form of warfare against nature rather than a cooperative relationship with the environment. The treatment of domestic animals became more cruel and systematic as people who had been desensitized to human suffering found it even easier to ignore the pain of creatures they considered inferior. Slaughtering techniques that had once been designed to minimize animal suffering were replaced by methods that prioritized efficiency over compassion. Crop rotation and soil management practices were abandoned in favor of methods that extracted maximum immediate yield, regardless of long-term consequences. The idea of stewardship, of caring for the land for future generations, became incomprehensible to people who had learned to think only in terms of immediate survival and advantage. The relationship between different social classes was fundamentally altered by the spread of battlefield culture throughout medieval society. The traditional bonds of loyalty and obligation that had held the feudal system together began to dissolve as both nobles and commoners adopted military thinking in their dealings with each other. Peasants who had been exposed to battlefield realities began to see their lords not as protectors, but as exploiters who would sacrifice them without hesitation for personal advantage. They learned that the promises of protection and justice that justified their servitude were lies, and they began to respond accordingly. Nobles, for their part, began to see their subjects as resources to be consumed rather than people to be protected. The concept of noblesse oblige, of privilege balanced by responsibility, became meaningless to aristocrats who had learned to see every relationship in terms of dominance and submission. The result was a breakdown of social cohesion that would have lasting effects on European development. The trust and cooperation that had made feudalism functional, however flawed it might have been, was replaced by mutual suspicion and exploitation that made effective governance increasingly difficult. Rebellions and uprisings became more common and more violent as traumatized populations lost faith in traditional authority structures. These weren't just political protests. They were expressions of psychological damage that had accumulated over generations of exposure to extreme violence. The peasant revolts that swept through medieval Europe weren't driven primarily by economic grievances, though those certainly existed. They were manifestations of collective trauma that had reached critical mass, explosions of accumulated rage and despair that had been building for decades or centuries. The savagery that characterized these uprisings shocked contemporary chroniclers. But it shouldn't have been surprising. Populations that had been systematically brutalized for generations had learned to express themselves in the only language that their oppressors understood. Violence had become the universal medium of communication in medieval society. The responses to these rebellions were equally savage, reflecting the fact that the ruling classes had undergone the same psychological transformations as their subjects. Nobles who might once have responded to peasant grievances with negotiation and compromise, instead responded with systematic massacre and torture. The cycle of violence and retaliation that characterized these conflicts wasn't just political, it was psychological. Both sides had been conditioned to see extreme brutality as normal and necessary, making peaceful resolution literally unthinkable. Urban development was profoundly affected by the militarization of medieval consciousness. Cities that had once been designed as centers of commerce and culture were transformed into fortified camps where every building and every street was planned with warfare in mind. The architecture of medieval cities began to reflect the assumption that violence was inevitable and constant. Public spaces were designed to facilitate crowd control and military movement rather than community gathering and celebration. Private buildings were constructed more like miniature fortresses than homes or shops. The layout of medieval streets wasn't just about practicality or tradition, it was about military strategy. Narrow, winding passages that could be easily defended, dead ends that could trap invading forces, buildings positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. These weren't accidental features, but deliberate design choices made by people who assumed that their cities would be battlefields. Even the placement of churches and other public buildings reflected military thinking. These structures weren't just spiritual or civic centers, they were potential strongholds that could be defended if the city walls were breached. Their thick walls and defensive positions weren't just architectural preferences, but conscious preparations for siege warfare. The development of municipal governments was similarly influenced by battlefield culture. City councils weren't just administrative bodies, but military commands that were expected to organize defense and coordinate resistance against enemies both external and internal. The legal codes that governed urban life were increasingly militaristic, emphasizing discipline and obedience over justice and fairness. Municipal law wasn't just about maintaining order, but about preparing populations for warfare through constant practice in following orders and accepting authority. The economic life of medieval cities was organized around military necessity rather than commercial efficiency. Trade routes were planned with defense in mind. Manufacturing was focused on military equipment, and financial resources were allocated primarily for fortification and weaponry. Cultural life in medieval cities was similarly constrained by military priorities. Festivals and celebrations were increasingly martial in character, emphasizing military virtues over artistic or intellectual achievement. Public entertainment became more violent and competitive, reflecting populations that had lost the ability to enjoy peaceful pleasures. Educational institutions in medieval cities were transformed into training grounds for future soldiers and administrators of violence. Schools that might have taught literature, philosophy, and the arts instead focused on military engineering, weapons handling, and the logistics of warfare. The family structures that had once been the foundation of medieval society were systematically destroyed by the psychological effects of battlefield culture. Traditional patterns of marriage, child-rearing, and household organization became impossible to maintain in environments where violence was constant and unpredictable. Marriage itself was transformed from a partnership based on mutual support and affection into a strategic alliance designed to maximize survival chances in a hostile world. Romantic love became a luxury that few could afford, replaced by practical calculations about protection, resources, and genetic fitness for violence. Child-rearing practices that had once emphasized nurturing and education were replaced by methods designed to produce individuals capable of surviving and participating in extreme violence. Children were deliberately traumatized and brutalized, not out of cruelty, but from a genuine belief that such treatment was necessary preparation for adult life. The relationship between parents and children was poisoned by the knowledge that those children would likely die violent deaths or become perpetrators of violence themselves. The emotional bonds that had once held families together became sources of pain and vulnerability that many parents learned to suppress or avoid entirely. Extended family networks that had once provided support and stability were disrupted by the constant mobility and high mortality rates associated with military life. The accumulated wisdom and cultural knowledge that had been passed down through generations was lost as traditional family structures collapsed under the pressure of constant warfare. The role of women in medieval society underwent dramatic changes as the traditional protections and restrictions that had governed female behavior became impossible to maintain in environments of constant violence. Women who had once been shielded from direct participation in warfare found themselves thrust into roles that required them to witness, participate in, or manage the aftermath of extreme brutality. Some women adapted by developing their own capacity for violence, becoming warriors, torturers, or military commanders who could match their male counterparts in brutality and strategic thinking. These women often found that abandoning traditional feminine roles was the only way to survive in militarized societies. Others retreated into forms of religious mysticism or mental illness that allowed them to dissociate from realities too horrible to process consciously. Convents became refuges not just for spiritual seekers, but for women who had been psychologically shattered by their exposure to battlefield culture. Still others found ways to profit from the violence around them, becoming suppliers of military equipment, organizers of medical care for wounded soldiers, or managers of the economic systems that supported constant warfare. These women often developed a hardness and cynicism that would have been unthinkable in their grandmother's generation. The concept of feminine virtue was radically redefined to accommodate the realities of militarized society. Qualities that had once been valued in women, gentleness, compassion, emotional sensitivity, came to be seen as weaknesses that endangered survival. New ideals of female behavior emphasized toughness, practical competence, and the ability to function effectively in violent environments. Motherhood was transformed from a nurturing relationship into a form of military training. Women who had once focused on protecting their children from harm were forced to prepare them for lives of violence and suffering. The lullabies they sang contained lessons about death and warfare rather than comfort and love. The sexual relationships between men and women were corrupted by the psychological damage that both parties had sustained. Intimacy became difficult or impossible for people who had learned to see every human interaction as potentially dangerous. Trust and vulnerability, the foundation sureties that few could afford, the of healthy relationships, became luxe. Demographic effects of these changes were severe and long-lasting. Birth rates declined as fewer people were willing or able to form stable relationships and raise children in such hostile environments. Those children who were born often suffered from the psychological damage inherited from traumatized parents. The quality of childcare deteriorated as communities lost the accumulated wisdom about nurturing and education that had been developed over previous generations. Children raised in militarized environments often suffered from developmental problems that affected their ability to form relationships and contribute to society. The intellectual and cultural development of medieval Europe was stunted by the diversion of human resources toward military purposes and the suppression of activities that didn't contribute directly to warfare. The Renaissance that eventually emerged in later centuries was delayed by centuries of cultural stagnation, caused by the militarization of European consciousness. Scientific and technological development was channeled almost exclusively toward military applications, preventing advances in agriculture, medicine, and other fields that could have improved the quality of life for ordinary people. The knowledge and skills that might have led to earlier breakthroughs in navigation, manufacturing, and communication were instead devoted to creating more efficient methods of killing and destruction. Artistic expression was constrained by the demands of military culture and the psychological limitations of traumatized populations. The creativity and imagination that had characterized earlier periods of European culture were suppressed in favor of forms of expression that reflected and reinforced military values. Literary traditions that had once celebrated love, beauty, and spiritual transcendence were replaced by narratives focused on violence, suffering, and death. The oral traditions that had preserved cultural wisdom and moral guidance for previous generations were corrupted by the incorporation of military themes and values. Musical traditions underwent similar transformations, with complex harmonies and sophisticated compositions, giving way to simpler forms that could be performed by soldiers and that reinforced martial themes. The subtle emotional expressions that had characterized earlier musical traditions were replaced by rhythms and melodies designed to inspire aggression and suppress empathy. The visual arts were similarly constrained by the demands of militarized culture. Painting, sculpture, and architecture that had once celebrated human beauty and divine transcendence instead focused on depicting violence and reinforcing social hierarchies based on military power. The religious and spiritual life of medieval Europe was profoundly corrupted by the influence of battlefield culture. Traditional Christian teachings about love, forgiveness, and peace became impossible to reconcile with the realities of systematic violence and brutality. Theological developments during this period were largely focused on finding ways to justify and sanctify violence, rather than on exploring deeper spiritual truths or developing more sophisticated understanding of divine nature. The intellectual resources of the Church were diverted toward creating elaborate rationalizations for behaviors that earlier Christians would have considered fundamentally evil. The mystical traditions that had once provided pathways to spiritual transcendence were corrupt metaphors. Spiritual practices that had once emphasized love, amped by the intrusion of military imagery and violent unity, instead focused on warfare against evil and the conquest of sin. The institutional structure of the church was militarized, with bishops and abbots taking on roles more like military commanders than spiritual leaders. Monasteries were transformed into fortified compounds that could serve as military bases, and monks were trained in weapons handling and military tactics. The relationship between the church and secular authority was fundamentally altered by the shared participation in systematic violence. Religious and political leaders became partners in brutality rather than representatives of different value systems, eliminating one of the few potential sources of moral restraint on military behavior. The concept of sanctuary, which had once provided protection for those fleeing violence, was systematically violated and eventually abandoned as church properties became military targets and religious personnel became combatants. The sacred and secular realms merged into a single system organized around the production and management of violence. The psychological effects of this corruption of religious life were devastating for populations that had once looked to the church for moral guidance and spiritual comfort. When religious authorities not only failed to condemn systematic brutality, but actively participated in and encouraged it, ordinary people were left without any framework for understanding or coping with the violence that surrounded them. Some responded by developing their own forms of religious expression that emphasized personal relationship with the divine rather than institutional authority. These movements often incorporated elements drawn from pre-Christian traditions or developed entirely new theological frameworks that could accommodate the realities of life in militarized societies. Others abandoned religious belief entirely, becoming cynical about all forms of spiritual or moral authority. These individuals often developed nihilistic philosophies that saw violence and suffering as the only reliable constants in human existence. Still others retreated into forms of religious extremism that sought to outcompete the institutional church in terms of spiritual purity or divine favor. These movements often became even more violent and intolerant than the military culture they were reacting against. The long-term effects of this corruption of religious life extended far beyond the medieval period itself. The patterns of thought and behavior that were established during this era would continue to influence European Christianity for centuries, contributing to religious wars, inquisitions, and other forms of systematic religious violence. The relationship between Christianity and violence that was forged during the medieval period would also influence European colonial expansion and the treatment of indigenous populations around the world. The theological justifications for conquest and conversion that were developed during the Crusades would be recycled and refined for use against Native Americans, Africans, and Asians. The medieval battlefield had succeeded in corrupting not just individual psychology and social structures, but the very spiritual foundations of European civilization. It had transformed Christianity from a religion of love and peace into an ideology of conquest and domination, creating patterns of thought and behavior that would have global consequences for centuries to come. The transformation of European consciousness that occurred during the medieval period represented one of the most profound and tragic changes in human history. A civilization that had once shown promise of developing more humane and sophisticated forms of social organization was instead diverted toward increasingly brutal and destructive patterns that would influence the entire trajectory of world history. The dark secrets of the medieval battlefield weren't just about what happened to individual soldiers or even individual societies. They were about what happened to human civilization itself when subjected to levels of organized violence that exceeded its capacity to process and integrate. The psychological mutations that were produced by this exposure to extreme violence would continue to shape human behavior long after the specific military technologies and political structures that had created them became obsolete. The medieval battlefield had revealed something about human nature that perhaps should have remained hidden, that the qualities that make civilization possible are far more fragile than anyone had ever imagined, and that under sufficient pressure, they can be not just damaged, but permanently altered in ways that make their recovery extremely difficult if not impossible. The seeds of destruction that were planted on medieval battlefields would continue to bear fruit for centuries to come, influencing everything from colonial expansion to industrial warfare to modern genocide. The psychological patterns that were established during this period would prove remarkably persistent and adaptable, finding new expressions in each successive generation while maintaining their essential character as systems optimized for violence and destruction. This was the ultimate legacy of the medieval battlefield, not just the immediate death and suffering it caused, but the long-term transformation of human consciousness that it produced. Medieval Europe had conducted an experiment on itself, testing the limits of how much organized violence a civilization could absorb before it fundamentally changed into something else entirely. The results of that experiment were still unfolding centuries later, as the patterns of thought and behavior that had been established on medieval killing fields continued to shape human history in ways that most people never realized or understood. The medieval battlefield had created a form of cultural DNA that would be passed down through generations, carrying within it the codes for systematic violence and the suppression of human empathy. The dark secrets of the medieval battlefield were ultimately about the future that had been created by those killing fields, a future in which the capacity for organized brutality had become permanently embedded in human consciousness, waiting to be activated whenever the right conditions presented themselves. The medieval battlefield had planted seeds that would continue to grow and spread, contaminating human civilization with patterns of violence and destruction that seemed to become more sophisticated and deadly with each passing generation. But even this comprehensive transformation of human consciousness wasn't the end of the story, because what medieval Europe had created through its systematic cultivation of violence was something that would prove to be self-perpetuating and adaptive, capable of evolving new forms and finding new expressions long after the original conditions that had produced it were gone. The psychological patterns that had been established on medieval battlefields didn't simply disappear when the technology of warfare changed or when political structures evolved. Instead, they became embedded in the cultural DNA of European civilization, passed down through generations not as conscious knowledge, but as unconscious assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Consider what happened when these traumatized populations began to expand beyond the borders of Europe itself. The same mental frameworks that had been developed for dealing with battlefield violence were applied to encounters with indigenous populations in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The conquistadors who slaughtered Aztecs and Incas weren't operating according to new principles of behavior. They were simply applying the lessons they had learned from centuries of European warfare to new targets and new environments. The slave traders, who developed the Atlantic trade in human beings, weren't inventing new forms of cruelty. They were adapting techniques of dehumanization and systematic brutality that had been perfected on European battlefields over the course of centuries. The ability to see other human beings as objects to be used and discarded, the capacity to inflict suffering without emotional engagement, the skill at organizing large-scale systems of violence and exploitation, all of these had been learned in the killing fields of medieval Europe. The colonial administrators who carved up Africa and Asia weren't operating from economic motives alone. They were expressing psychological patterns that had been established by generations of exposure to systematic violence. The bureaucratic efficiency with which they organized genocide and cultural destruction reflected mental frameworks that had been developed for managing the logistics of medieval warfare. The industrial systems that emerged in later centuries weren't just technological innovations. They were expressions of consciousness that had been shaped by medieval battlefield culture. The ability to organize human beings into efficient systems of production, the willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for collective goals, the comfort with treating people as interchangeable units in larger mechanisms. All of these reflected ways of thinking that had been learned through centuries of military organization. The factory systems that characterized early industrial development weren't just economic arrangements. They were applications of military organizational principles to civilian production. The discipline, hierarchy, and systematic exploitation that characterized industrial labor were direct descendants of the methods that had been developed for managing medieval armies. The urban planning that created industrial cities reflected the same priorities that had shaped medieval fortress design: efficiency, control, and the ability to manage large populations under stress took precedence over human comfort or community building. The slums and industrial districts that characterized these cities weren't accidental byproducts of economic development. They were deliberate applications of lessons learned from managing military encampments and siege conditions. The educational systems that were developed to serve industrial societies reflected the same priorities that had shaped military training. Discipline, obedience, and the ability to function effectively in hierarchical organizations were emphasized over creativity, critical thinking, or individual development. Schools weren't just places of learning, they were institutions designed to produce human beings who could function effectively in militarized social systems. The political structures that emerged in modern European states weren't just responses to changing economic conditions. They were expressions of consciousness that had been shaped by centuries of military culture. The bureaucratic efficiency, systematic surveillance, and capacity for organized violence that characterized these states reflected mental patterns that had been established on medieval battlefields. The legal systems that governed these modern states weren't just rational responses to social complexity. They were applications of military justice principles to civilian populations. The emphasis on punishment over rehabilitation, the acceptance of systematic surveillance and control, the willingness to use violence to enforce compliance, all reflected ways of thinking that had been learned through centuries of military discipline. The economic systems that developed during this period weren't just responses to technological innovation. They were expressions of psychological patterns that had been established by medieval battlefield culture. The willingness to exploit natural resources without regard for long-term consequences, the comfort with treating human beings as economic units, the acceptance of systematic inequality and suffering, all reflected mental frameworks that had been developed for managing the logistics of warfare. The scientific and technological developments that characterized the modern period weren't just expressions of human curiosity and creativity. They were largely driven by military priorities and shaped by consciousness that had been formed through centuries of exposure to systematic violence. The technologies that were developed, the research priorities that were established, the applications that were pursued, all reflected the influence of militarized thinking on human intellectual development. The artistic and cultural expressions that emerged during this period weren't just aesthetic innovations. They were attempts to process and express experiences that had been shaped by centuries of exposure to systematic violence. The themes, techniques, and priorities that characterized modern European art reflected consciousness that had been fundamentally altered by battlefield culture. Even the religious and philosophical developments that occurred during this period weren't independent intellectual achievements. They were responses to spiritual crises that had been created by the corruption of traditional belief systems through their association with systematic violence. The new forms of religious expression that emerged, the philosophical systems that were developed, the ethical frameworks that were proposed, all were attempts to deal with problems that had been created by the militarization of European consciousness. The medieval battlefield stands as perhaps the darkest mirror of human civilization, reflecting not the noble ideals we've constructed in our stories and songs, but the terrifying reality of what we become when every restraint is stripped away. These weren't just places where armies met and fought. They were laboratories of human transformation, forges that hammered ordinary people into something fundamentally different, something optimized for violence and suffering. What makes this history so haunting isn't just the scale of brutality or the primitive horror of medieval medicine. It's the recognition that these battlefields created psychological patterns that would echo through centuries of human development. The same consciousness that could participate in systematic torture, that could walk through fields of mutilated corpses without flinching, that could see human suffering as entertainment rather than tragedy, would later fuel colonial expansion, industrial exploitation, and forms of organized violence that we're still grappling with today. The knights and soldiers who survived these killing fields didn't just return home with physical scars. They carried within them a transformed understanding of human nature itself, a knowledge that civilization is far more fragile than we dare to imagine. They had learned that beneath the thin veneer of culture and morality lies something savage and desperate, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Medieval Europe conducted an experiment on itself, testing how much organized violence a society could absorb before it fundamentally changed into something else entirely. The results were written not just in the bones scattered across forgotten battlefields, but in the consciousness of generations that followed. These weren't isolated historical events. They were the birth pangs of a new kind of human being, one adapted for systematic cruelty, but increasingly incapable of the cooperation and creativity that had once defined our species. Tonight, we've walked through the blood and mud of medieval battlefields, witnessed the primitive butchery of battlefield medicine, explored the systematic torture of prisoners, and seen how disease and psychological trauma created wounds that never healed. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation is how completely this transformation was internalized by those who experienced it. They didn't see themselves as victims of a process of dehumanization. They believed they had discovered hard truths about reality that their ancestors had been too naive to acknowledge. The dark secrets of the medieval battlefield continue to whisper through our modern world, reminding us that the capacity for systematic violence isn't an aberration or an accident. It's a learned behavior, cultivated through specific conditions and transmitted across generations like a virus of the mind. Understanding this history isn't just about satisfying curiosity about the past. It's about recognizing patterns that continue to shape human behavior in ways we're only beginning to comprehend. The medieval battlefield taught us that the line between civilization and savagery isn't a wall. It's a thread, and it's thinner than we ever dared to imagine.